Welcome back to the deep dive. We are plunging into a topic that, well, if we're being honest, it probably touches all of us at some point,
Hmm.
and maybe much more frequently than we even realize.
That's often the case with these thinking patterns.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking about those tricky, sort of unhelpful patterns of thinking our brains can just fall
Yeah.
into. And today, our focus is on one specific pattern, a cognitive distortion that can feel incredibly heavy, isolating, even.
Yes.
It's called personalization, that habit of automatically taking things personally, internalizing blame,
Right.
even when an event or situation isn't really about you, or at least not in the way your mind immediately tells you it is.
That immediate leap is key.
So for this deep dive, we've pulled together some really insightful sources. We're drawing from materials that break down these cognitive distortions, these common ways our thinking gets a bit warped, you know?
Right. Glitches in the system, so to speak.
Exactly. And we're exploring the crucial differences between like healthy responsibility and unhealthy ways of taking responsibility.
Which is a really fine line sometimes.
It really is. We're also looking at research into the often surprising roots of self-blame. Where does it come from?
Hmm.
And the really important connection between being critical of yourself and the potential power of self-compassion.
Yes, that contrast is vital.
Yeah.
These sources help illuminate not just the what of personalization, but the why it happens, and importantly, how we can navigate it.
Right.
They emphasize, as one source really points out, that these thinking styles can become quite automatic. They operate almost, below our conscious radar.
Sneaky.
Which is why they can be so persistent and why they can cause, frankly, significant distress when they're consistently influencing how we see the world and, crucially, our place in it.
So our mission today is, well, it sounds straightforward, but I think it's pretty powerful. We want to understand personalization inside and out.
Get under the hood.
Yeah. We'll dig into what it actually is, explore some of the deep-seated reasons why someone might develop this particular pattern. Exactly. Look at how it shows up, in the small, everyday moments, but also in the bigger, more significant events in our lives.
It's across the board.
And maybe most importantly, provide you, listening, with some concrete strategies, ways to recognize it when it's happening and actively shift your thinking. Move towards a more accurate, balanced, and ultimately, healthier sense of responsibility.
Practical tools.
That's the goal. This deep dive is designed to give you insights and practical tools to help quiet that internal noise, especially when it feels like information overload is coming from your own thoughts about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's really unpack this then. At its core, what is personalization?
Yeah.
How does it actually show up in our thoughts and feelings?
Okay. So personalization, it's classified as one of the key unhelpful thinking styles or cognitive distortions. And essentially, it's the tendency to automatically blame yourself for negative external events.
Automatically.
Yes, automatically.
Yep.
Even when you have very little or sometimes no actual control over them. It's that automatic mental leap. Your mind takes something outside of yourself that went wrong and ties it back specifically to something you did, or just as often, something you failed to do.
So if it rains on my picnic, my first thought isn't bad luck. It's I should have checked the forecast more thoroughly, or I jinxed it.
It can absolutely manifest like that, yes. The sources give a couple of examples that are almost comically mundane, but they're incredibly relatable.
Okay.
Because they highlight just how automatic this can be. Take burning the toast at breakfast.
Right. Classic.
The personalized thought isn't, oh, the coaster settings were wrong, or maybe this bread toasts faster. No. It's immediately, oh, I burned the toast.
My fault.
I must have done something wrong. I can't even make simple toast correctly. It becomes a reflection on your competence.
Right. You internalize a kitchen appliance malfunction or just, bread variability as a personal failing. Or you feel this surge of guilt because you didn't stand there and, micromanage the toaster.
Precisely. Or another classic example mentioned is a child playing a wrong note during, say, a school musical performance.
Oh, yeah. Painful.
The parent observing, if they're prone to personalization, might immediately think, that's my fault.
Not, oops, she slipped, or he's nervous.
No, it's, I should have made them practice more.
Yeah.
Or, I wasn't a good enough parent to ensure they mastered that piece.
Wow. Okay, that hits home for, I think, any parent or caregiver. You instantly project their performance onto your own effort or your perceived shortcomings as a parent. It's like
Exactly.
you see yourself as solely responsible for outcomes that are clearly influenced by, a multitude of factors, right?
Absolutely. The child's practice, their nerves on the day, the instrument itself, the teacher's instruction, maybe they didn't sleep well.
Right, countless things.
But the personalization assigns undue blame to yourself. It's taking negative events that happen outside of you, or situations where maybe you only played a small or even indirect role, and relating them back to yourself as the primary or sometimes even the sole cause.
And you said it's often unconscious.
Yes, that's what one source really emphasizes. It happens often without conscious effort. It's like a mental reflex, a habit.
Hmm.
And when this becomes a consistent pattern, that's where the trouble really starts. It leads to significant emotional distress. It shows up as intense guilt, self-criticism, and sometimes a deeper sense of shame.
You mentioned guilt and shame there. Can you just clarify the difference in this context? Because they feel similar but aren't quite the same.
That's a really important distinction, and the sources touch upon this, especially when discussing self-criticism. Guilt is typically related to behavior. You feel guilty because you believe you did something wrong or failed to do something right.
Okay, an action.
Right. Shame, however, is deeper. It's about seeing oneself as fundamentally a bad person. You feel shame because you believe you are inherently flawed or inadequate or unworthy. So with personalization, because you're constantly blaming yourself for external negative outcomes, it's really easy for that feeling to slide from I did something wrong, which is guilt, to things go wrong because I am wrong or bad, which is shame.
Wow.
It moves from judging an action, which we all do, to judging your entire self, your core being. And that is a far, far heavier burden to carry.
That distinction, judging an action versus judging your core self, that makes so much sense why personalization feels so debilitating. It's not just, oops, I made a mistake. It's, I am a mistake.
Precisely. It's attacking your very identity, not just evaluating a behavior in context.
Which explains why it feels so crushing. Like you're solely responsible for fixing or preventing everything bad that happens around you, no matter what the actual factors are.
It is. It creates this immense, often impossible sense of responsibility.
So, okay, it's clearly not limited to just, burnt toast or small mishaps. How does this pattern of personalization, or maybe this over-responsibility, as you called it, show up in bigger ways? How does it impact our relationships, our work, our just general sense of well-being?
Yeah, it scales up significantly. Personalization is intimately linked to that broader tendency one source specifically refers to as over-responsibility.
Okay.
And this isn't just, say, taking on tasks that aren't yours, although that can be part of it. It's more about internalizing the emotional weight and the blame for situations that really fall outside your true scope of control.
Right.
The source that draws on coaching insights provides a really fundamental framework for understanding this. It's the critical difference between control and influence.
Control versus influence.
Ah.
Okay, this feels absolutely essential. Like maybe the core thing to grasp here.
I think it really is the bedrock.
Yeah.
You control, well, a very specific and actually quite limited set of things in this world.
What are they?
What you think, what you feel your internal emotional state, what you say your communication, and what you do your own behaviors.
My thoughts, feelings, words, actions. That's it.
That's essentially the list of
Okay.
what you have direct control over.
Mhm.
What you absolutely do not control is, well, almost everything else.
Like
What other people think, what other people feel,
Mm.
what external circumstances occur, the weather, the economy, unexpected events, traffic jams,
Right.
how other people choose to act or react.
Right.
You simply don't control those things. Now, you can, and you often do, influence them.
Okay. Influence.
Your actions might influence someone's feelings, certainly.
Yeah.
Your planning might influence the outcome of a project. But influence is not control. It's probabilistic, not deterministic.
Okay. So personalization is basically treating something you merely influenced maybe or perhaps had no hand in at all as if you had complete control over it.
Exactly.
And then taking all the blame when the outcome isn't what you wanted or hoped for. You internalize the failure of the influence as if it were a failure of imagined control.
That's a perfect way to frame it. And the source illustrates this beautifully with an example from a manager coaching one of her team members.
Okay, tell me about that.
So the situation was, the team member had forgotten to book their flights for an important business trip the whole team was committed to taking.
Oops. Big oversight.
Big oversight. And the team member was, understandably, upset about the increased last-minute cost and the hassle They approached the manager kind of hoping for an exception or maybe some form of bailout from the company budget.
Okay, so how did the manager handle it? Did they address it from a place of healthy responsibility, like, okay, this was your task?
Oh, no. According to the source, the manager immediately defaulted to what they call over-responsibility rescue mode.
Rescue mode, okay.
Her internal reaction wasn't focused on the team member's accountability. It was immediate stress and guilt, but not for anything she had done wrong.
So guilt for what?
Guilt for the team member's mistake, the forgetting the flights part, and also guilt and stress about the team member's subsequent emotional distress and the financial hit they were taking.
Wow. So she personalized the team members' oversight and their feelings, basically internalizing them as her own failure or her own problem that she was somehow obligated to solve and like carry the emotional weight for.
Precisely. She took it on. The source does acknowledge this often stems from noble intentions, caring, wanting to help, wanting the team member not to suffer.
Sure, you want to support your team.
Of course. But it highlights that this specific form of caring, this over-responsibility, is actually unhealthy, especially for the person practicing it, the manager in this case.
Why unhealthy?
Because the manager was taking on the emotional burden and the stress for a situation that was entirely outside of her control. Booking the flights was the team member's responsibility.
Right.
The manager couldn't control whether or not the team member remembered to do it. She could influence, maybe remind, set expectations, but not control the actual action.
And the source mentioned a ripple effect too, right? Like how did the rest of the team react?
Yes, that was a key point. While the manager was caught up in personalizing this guilt and trying to figure out how to rescue the situation, the rest of the team, who had done their part, booked their flights, possibly rearranging personal plans to do so, were watching.
Watching their leader? What?
Watching their leader implicitly endorse, or at least consider rescuing, someone who hadn't fulfilled their commitment due to their own oversight. It undermines accountability across the whole team.
Yeah, I can see how that would erode morale or fairness.
Definitely. And it's just exhausting for the manager. This over-responsibility, fueled by personalization, means constantly feeling stressed and guilty for outcomes you aren't actually responsible for.
It sounds draining.
It is. And as the source on Thinking Styles notes, this distorted view forces you to focus on the negative or inaccurate part of reality specifically, inflating your own perceived role in causing those negative outcomes.
How does this play out outside of work? Like in personal relationships, that seems like fertile ground for personalization.
Oh, absolutely. In personal relationships, personalization can manifest in so many ways. Feeling responsible for your partner's mood.
They seem quiet. It must be something I did or said.
Exactly. Or feeling responsible for your friend's happiness. My friend seems down. I clearly haven't done enough to cheer them up.
Or even like the success or failure of a first date.
Definitely. They didn't text back immediately, I must have been boring, or I wasn't attractive enough. You take their independent choices, their feelings, their reactions, which could be influenced by a million things unrelated to you.
Their own bad day, their own preferences.
Exactly. And you interpret them solely through the lens of your own actions or your perceived inadequacy. Instead of recognizing their agency, their external stressors, or maybe just simply differing preferences or styles of communication.
So if a friend cancels plans last minute, the personalized thought isn't, oh, bummer, hope they're okay, or they must be swamped. It goes straight to,
They canceled because they don't really like spending time with me, or I must have done something to make them not want to see me.
and those feelings that come with it.
Yeah.
You mentioned guilt and shame earlier.
Yes, that constant sort of low-grade hum of guilt, or the sharp sting of shame when you feel you failed someone or caused a problem. Just pervasive emotional distress. It's incredibly tiring to carry that level of perceived responsibility for everything and everyone around you.
It truly sounds like carrying the weight of the world, or at least your small corner of it, on your shoulders for every little thing that goes wrong.
It is. And it significantly depletes your emotional and mental resources, which ironically makes it harder to deal effectively with the things you are genuinely responsible for.
Okay, so this tendency towards self-blame, this personalization,
Yeah.
doesn't just pop up out of nowhere, right?
Mm.
It often feels so deeply ingrained. Where does this stuff usually come from? What sets the stage for someone to develop this habit?
That's a crucial question. And the sources we looked at, particularly one focusing specifically on the origins of self-blame, strongly suggest that these patterns are frequently shaped, really forged, in our early experiences.
Childhood stuff.
Yes, the environment we grow up in. Our childhood interactions, our relationships with caregivers can, sometimes quite unconsciously, condition us. They teach us to believe that our worth, or whether things turn out well or poorly in relationships or situations, is primarily, or maybe even solely, dependent on us and our behavior.
Okay, let's really dig into some of those specific experiences the source mentions. Can you give some examples? What kind of childhood environments might, like, cultivate this ground for adult personalization and self-blame?
Sure. One major factor highlighted is growing up with absent or unpredictable caregivers.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
It means the love, attention, or even just basic care you received was inconsistent. Maybe sometimes it was available and warm, but other times it was distant or conditional or just not there.
Right, unreliable.
Unreliable. If you experienced that, you might have felt as a child that you constantly had to earn their love or attention or approval because it wasn't a given.
So you're always trying to figure out the formula.
Exactly. And this creates a deep-seated insecurity. As an adult, this can manifest as internalizing the belief that if relationships falter or situations don't work out as you hoped, you must be the fundamental problem
Because you didn't perform correctly?
because you failed to earn the positive outcome. You might then desperately seek external validation, always looking outside yourself for confirmation of your worth, because that fundamental sense of feeling consistently seen, loved, and secure wasn't reliably present in your formative years. The source actually quotes a clinical psychologist on this, noting that neglect can make a child feel invisible,
Invisible. Wow.
leading them to constantly try to fill that void later with achievements or maybe even superficial relationships because that foundational security is just missing.
That makes perfect sense. If you learned early on that connection and safety were unpredictable and seemed tied to your performance, then any negative outcome later feels like proof you failed to perform correctly.
Exactly. It becomes the default explanation.
Yeah.
Another really powerful influence is being overly criticized by parents or primary caregivers.
Constantly hearing you're not good enough.
Yes. Growing up constantly hearing you weren't good enough, that your efforts weren't sufficient, maybe that you were inherently flawed in some way, regardless of how hard you tried to please or gain approval. This deeply, deeply erodes self-worth.
I can imagine.
It fuels an intense fear of failure and often an overwhelming need for external validation just to feel okay.
To counteract the inner critic.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this fear and need can trigger that automatic assumption of responsibility for anything that goes wrong, even if you were only minimally involved or not involved at all. You become terrified of accepting your own imperfections
Because.
because you were essentially taught that those imperfections made you unworthy of love or acceptance.
So the external critic, the parent's voice, becomes your own harsh inner critic, always ready to blame you for anything less than perfection.
That's a very common pathway. A third major contributor mentioned is being given too much responsibility for family matters as a child.
What does that look like? Like chores?
It goes way beyond normal chores or helping out. It involves situations where children have to act almost as surrogate parents for younger siblings, or immediate, intense, maybe scary parental disputes, or carry adult emotional burdens like being a confidant for a parent's problems.
Parentification.
Exactly, that's the term often used. The source highlights how this fundamentally distorts a child's view of relationships. They learn they must prioritize others' needs above their own, and they often struggle immensely later to ask for help for themselves.
Because they were always the helper, the responsible one.
Right. They might feel isolated, overwhelmed, and internalize the belief that they are personally responsible for maintaining the family's stability or emotional well-being, a burden far, far too heavy for any child.
So this blurs the lines of appropriate responsibility from a very early age, makes it hard to know where your job ends and someone else's begins later in life.
It fundamentally messes with those boundaries. Then there's emotional manipulation from parents. This one is particularly damaging.
How so?
If a parent used tactics like guilt trips, you're making me sick with worry because of your behavior, or look what you made me do,
Oh.
or gaslighting, that didn't happen, you're just imagining things, or you're just doing this to upset me. Or if they made you feel directly accountable for their emotional state, their happiness, their moods,
Like walking on eggshells.
constantly. You learn to constantly police your own behavior and take on responsibility for their feelings. This habit of self-blame becomes deeply ingrained, stemming directly from being taught, implicitly or explicitly, that you are the cause of another person's complex emotional life.
That's a terrible, impossible thing to teach a child that they are somehow in control of another person's inner world.
It sets them up for significant personalization later, absolutely. Another factor is witnessing constant conflict between parents. especially if the child somehow felt like they were the cause.
How would a child feel they were the cause?
If they felt pressure to choose sides, maybe, or if they overheard arguments about themselves, or even if they just, in a child's way of making sense of things, concluded that their presence, their actions, or even their very existence fueled the tension or arguments between their parents.
That's an immense and unfair burden.
It is. And it can lead to struggling with blaming yourself for conflict or tension in your own adult relationships later on, even when you aren't the primary instigator or maybe have no real role in it at all.
Okay, what else?
Then there's receiving insufficient praise or encouragement. If positive feedback, simple acknowledgement, or just encouragement for effort was rare or absent during your upbringing.
You don't build up that internal sense of, I'm okay.
Exactly. You might grow up feeling you constantly need to prove your worth, often through achievement or external outcomes. So when things inevitably go wrong, a project fails, a relationship ends, you don't get the job. You take it intensely personally
Why?
because you haven't internalized a sense of inherent value that's independent of what you do or achieve. The source notes that adults from these backgrounds often find it incredibly difficult even to receive compliments
Really? Why?
because deep down they feel fundamentally undeserving of positive recognition. It doesn't match their internal narrative.
It's hard to believe you're okay just being if you were only ever validated for doing.
That's a great way to put it. Another pattern is not being allowed to make mistakes.
Like helicopter parenting, maybe? Or just extreme intolerance for errors?
It could be either. If
Yeah.
you were excessively protected from any possibility of failure, or if mistakes were met with really extreme disapproval, punishment, maybe ridicule,
Mm-hmm.
you didn't develop that crucial resilience.
The resilience that comes from messing up.
Yes, from messing up, acknowledging it, learning from it, and crucially realizing you survived it and can move forward. If you didn't get that experience, then as an adult, the fear of failure or disappointing someone becomes overwhelming.
So when something does go wrong,
Your immediate reaction is intense self-blame because you lack the learned ability, the internal tools to process failure in a healthy way that separates the outcome from your inherent worth.
failure becomes a catastrophic reflection of your entire identity's inadequacy, rather than just an event, maybe a painful one, but one you can learn from.
Precisely. Similarly, not being able to express or process emotions freely as a child has a profound impact.
Being told, boys don't cry, or stop being dramatic.
Things like that. If you are taught to suppress your feelings, told to be strong, stop crying, maybe that your emotions were inconvenient or a burden to others, you might really struggle to trust your own emotional responses as an adult. You second-guess your feelings constantly.
So what happens when something goes wrong?
Instead of sitting with or exploring your feelings related to the situation, anger, sadness, disappointment, whatever it is, your default is often immediate self-blame. Why? Because your emotions were never validated as important or useful information about the world or yourself.
So your internal warning system, your emotional compass, isn't trusted, which leads you to assume the problem must be you.
Exactly. It short-circuits the processing. Another factor mentioned is experiencing constant moving around and instability as a child.
Frequent moves, changing schools.
Yes, or other forms of instability, like frequent changes in caregivers, perhaps, especially if it happened without clear explanations that were appropriate for your age. If your home life felt unpredictable or chaotic,
How does that lead to self-blame?
a child might internalize a sense of responsibility for that lack of security. They might unconsciously blame themselves for the chaos, perhaps as a way to feel some sense of control over it.
That sounds counterintuitive.
It is, but it's a child's logic sometimes. If it's my fault, maybe I can fix it. This can lead to a deep-seated belief that you don't deserve stability and make it hard to feel safe, settled, or secure as an adult. The source points to research linking frequent childhood moves to negative impacts later on, which can unfortunately reinforce that internalized blame if it's not understood and processed.
You become the only constant thing in the instability and somehow assume you must be the cause, even if it's negative.
Yes, it's a child's way of trying to make sense of chaos,
Hmm?
often by putting themselves at the center, even if it means taking the blame. Then there's the expectation to always be perfect.
A pressure cooker.
Absolutely. If you were raised with the explicit or maybe just implicit belief that perfection was the only acceptable standard, the only way to get love or approval, well, you're set up for continuous failure and self-blame.
Because perfection is impossible.
Right. So because you were taught that falling short is a catastrophic reflection on your worth, you'll tend to believe that everything that goes wrong is your fault for not achieving that impossible standard. This expectation severely undermines your sense of self, leads to believing you won't be accepted unless you have this impressive list of accomplishments, and constantly triggers personalization whenever you inevitably make mistakes.
It sets an impossibly high bar, guaranteeing you'll feel like a failure and then blame yourself for not clearing it.
Absolute guarantees it.
Yeah.
And finally, the source mentions parental favoritism, particularly if it was openly displayed.
One sibling clearly being preferred over another.
Yes. If you were the child who wasn't the favorite, you might internalize the feeling that it's somehow your fault, that you aren't valued or loved as much as your sibling. You feel you have to constantly earn love and compassion that really should be unconditional.
That sounds incredibly painful.
It is. And it leads to profound struggles with feeling inherently unworthy as an adult. It can contribute to the belief that it's your own fault. You struggle to form meaningful, secure connections later in life because you feel fundamentally flawed or unlovable.
Wow. So these experiences often tangle together.
Yes, rarely just one.
They teach a child, sometimes consciously, but maybe more often at a deep unconscious level, that they are the central cause of negative events, or that their value is totally conditional.
Exactly. Conditional on external factors or others' unpredictable behavior or their own impossible performance. And this forms the psychological foundation, the fertile ground, for the adult habit of personalization and self-blame.
These sound like incredibly powerful, formative experiences. It's no wonder these patterns can feel so automatic and hard to shape.
They are incredibly powerful, and they create patterns, mental habits, that are indeed difficult to break without real conscious effort and awareness.
Okay, so this habit of constantly personalizing things, automatically blaming yourself, you said earlier it rarely exists in isolation.
That's right.
It's closely linked to something else.
Yes, it's very closely linked to another challenging internal pattern,
Yeah.
self-criticism.
Ah, yes. The inner taskmaster. The voice that seems to confirm every negative thought you might have about yourself.
Exactly that voice.
Yeah.
One source defines self-criticism pretty clearly as engaging in persistent, often harsh, self-scrutiny and evaluation.
Constantly judging yourself.
Constantly. And this behavior directly leads to those painful feelings we talked about. That deep sense of unworthiness, feelings of inferiority, believing you are a failure, and that pervasive guilt.
Mm-hmm.
Self-critical individuals are also often driven by a profound fear of disapproval and a deep fear of losing the acceptance of others. Their self-worth feels very conditional on external approval.
It makes perfect, albeit really painful, sense. If my default reaction to something going wrong is, it's my fault, that's the personalization, then my internal dialogue is constantly telling me I'm the problem, I'm messing up, I'm not good enough.
Right.
That ongoing negative internal commentary is self-criticism, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And it's a powerful self-perpetuating cycle, a vicious cycle, really. Personalization triggers the core self-critical thought. The project didn't get approved. That's my fault.
Okay.
Then the self-criticism jumps in and adds layers. And because it was my fault, I must be incompetent. I am a total failure who can't do anything right.
Ouch.
This intense negative self-judgment then makes you more sensitive to future negative outcomes. It primes you and makes you more likely to personalize future events because your baseline belief about yourself, fueled by the criticism, is fundamentally negative.
So the next time something goes wrong.
The thought is almost instant. Something unexpected happened. Well, obviously, it must be because I'm incompetent and I always mess things up. The self-criticism confirms the personalization, and the personalization feeds the self-criticism.
And the sources emphasize this isn't just about, being a perfectionist or having high standards for yourself. This kind of self-criticism is actually seen as a significant risk factor for serious psychological distress.
It absolutely is. One source specifically points out that self-criticism is considered a transdiagnostic risk factor. Meaning it's not tied to just one specific diagnosis like only depression or only anxiety. It's associated with and can worsen a diverse range of psychopathologies.
Like what?
Including various anxiety disorders, depression, eating disorders.
Yeah.
It can even predict greater severity of conditions like PTSD. It's incredibly destructive, both internally to your own well-being and often externally in how you navigate relationships. It's not just a minor personality trait. It has significant implications for mental health and overall functioning.
Okay, so where does the hope come into this picture? This sounds like a really difficult, tight loop to break.
Yeah.
Personalization, deeply rooted self-blame, intense self-criticism.
It can feel like a very tight loop, but that's precisely where the sources introduce the powerful counterpoint.
Yeah.
Self-compassion.
Yep.
While self-criticism is framed as a significant risk factor, Self-compassion is presented as a robust resilience factor, especially when you encounter those inevitable moments of personal inadequacy, making mistakes, experiencing failures.
So, how does self-compassion actually function here, particularly as an antidote to personalization and self-criticism?
Self-compassion, as defined in the source, involves actively treating yourself with kindness, care, and concern precisely when you are facing difficult moments.
When you most need it, but maybe at least feel you deserve it.
Exactly. When you're dealing with your own perceived inadequacies, when you've made mistakes, when you've experienced failures, or when you're just navigating painful life situations, it's fundamentally about meeting your own suffering, including the suffering that comes from making errors or experiencing negative outcomes with warmth and understanding, rather than harsh judgment.
So it's not just letting yourself off the hook.
No, not at all. And the source makes a crucial point here. It's more than just the absence of self-judgment. It's an active stance of care towards yourself. And the research links it strongly to healthier relationships, greater emotional well-being, and even better outcomes in psychological treatment. It's a key ingredient for mental health.
So if personalization defaults to, it's all my fault and I'm terrible because of it, and then self-criticism piles on with, yup, you are indeed terrible, unworthy, and a total failure, self-compassion offers a completely different internal response, like a different voice.
Absolutely. A fundamentally different internal response.
Yeah.
Self-compassion allows you to respond to a negative outcome or a mistake with something more like, okay, something went wrong here. That feels painful, and it's understandable to feel bad about it.
Acknowledging the feeling?
Yes. Then asking, how can I approach this moment with kindness towards myself? What actually happened? Can I look at this situation honestly and try to identify what parts were truly influenced by my controllable actions, what parts belong to others, and what parts were just external circumstances or bad luck? And importantly, how can I learn from this experience without tearing down my entire sense of self? The source explicitly notes that cultivating self-compassion provides concrete access points for actively reducing both self-criticism and that automatic habit of personalization.
Ah.
It enables you to acknowledge difficulty, failure, or imperfection without collapsing your entire sense of self-worth. It creates psychological space.
This feels like the absolute key to building the alternative path. It's acknowledging the reality of a negative event or a mistake, maybe taking appropriate responsibility, but doing so from a place of self-support and learning, rather than from blame and self-attack.
That is the core shift. It's about facing challenges or setbacks with an internal ally self-compassion instead of an internal adversary self-criticism fueled by personalization.
Okay, so we understand the patterns, the roots, the destructive cycle, and the alternative of self-compassion. How do we actually do it? How do we move from understanding to actively changing these patterns? How do we break the cycle of personalization and self-criticism and build that healthier sense of responsibility and self-compassion?
It begins really fundamentally with awareness. That comes up again and again in the sources on thinking styles. You have to first become adept at recognizing when the pattern of personalization is actually active in your mind.
Catching it in the act.
Exactly. Noticing that automatic self-blame kick in. Catching that immediate internal jump to taking responsibility for something that clearly isn't entirely or maybe even partially yours. Becoming aware of that surge of intense guilt or shame that feels disproportionate to your actual role in the situation.
It's about catching that initial thought or feeling before it completely spirals and takes over your mood.
Yes, precisely. And once you've taught it, which takes practice, the next crucial step is actively challenging that automatic pattern.
Yeah.
One of the most powerful practical tools for challenging it comes directly from that distinction we talked about earlier. Control versus influence. That insight from the coaching source.
Right, the bedrock idea. I only control my thoughts, feelings, words, and actions.
Exactly. You nail that down.
Okay.
And everything else, the actions of others, external events, the complex web of circumstances surrounding any event you can only influence at best,
Right.
or sometimes have absolutely no sway over at all.
Right.
The source uses a truly insightful metaphor here to make it concrete. The poker player.
Okay, tell me more about the poker player analogy. How does that relate to stopping personalization?
Okay, think about a poker game. What can a player actually control?
How much they bet when they fold, maybe their poker face.
Exactly. They control how they play their own hand, which cards they bet on, when they raise, when they fold, their demeanor, their strategy, based on the cards they have and what they perceive. Now, what do they not control?
The cards they get dealt. Who else is playing? How those other people bet? Luck.
Precisely. They don't control the cards dealt. That's random chance. They don't control who else is sitting at the table. And they absolutely do not control how the other players choose to play their cards based on their hands and their strategies.
Okay.
The source makes the point that the best poker players understand this distinction intuitively. They don't waste precious mental energy complaining about the bad hand they were dealt, or agonizing over why another player made a surprising move, or blaming the dealer.
They focus on their own game.
Yes, preoccupying yourself with things you don't control, whether it's the cards, the opponents, or external distractions, creates anxiety, drains your mental energy, and, crucially, distracts you from effectively playing the only thing you can control, your own hand.
Okay, so applying that to life.
Why?
The unhealthy personalization-fueled approach is fixating on and blaming yourself for the bad outcome, losing the game, getting a bad hand, like, I lost because I'm just a terrible player, blaming yourself for bad luck or other skill.
Yes, internalizing the loss as a reflection of your inadequacy.
Whereas the healthy approach, like a skilled poker player, is accepting the external circumstances, the cards, the opponents, the situation, and focusing all your attention and energy on playing your hand, which represents your controllable actions.
Your thoughts, feelings, words, behaviors.
Playing that hand the very best way you possibly can, given what's actually on the table.
That is precisely the shift in focus. In the game of life, your hand consists of your objective in a given situation, your chosen words, your behaviors, your attitude, your mindset. Regardless of the external circumstances, the cards you're dealt, and regardless of how others act or react the other player's moves, you direct your focus entirely onto responding with your best self, using the tools that are uniquely within your control.
Okay.
The source states this very directly. You are not responsible for how other people perceive you, how they receive your message, or how they feel about it. You are only responsible for what you give them in terms of your actions, words, and attitude.
Focusing on the output, not the reception.
Exactly. Staying focused on that controllable piece, your contribution, no matter the situation, is how you play like a pro in life, because you're concentrating your limited energy on the only thing you can actually impact with certainty, yourself and your own conduct.
This feels like a massive fundamental reorientation. Instead of automatically internalizing blame for events or outcomes that are influenced by countless external factors or other people's free will, you pivot. You evaluate your own controllable responses and actions within that situation.
Yes.
So the question becomes not, how is this my fault, but given this outcome that I didn't control, what did I do, say, think, or feel? Was that response aligned with my values or objectives? How could my response, the only part I truly control, be maybe different or better next time?
That is the absolute essence of healthy responsibility. It's about clearly discerning what part of a situation was truly yours to own meaning. What did your controllable actions realistically contribute versus what legitimately belonged to other people's choices, external chance, or circumstances you couldn't influence? The Center for Clinical Intervention source provides a really valuable self-reflection prompt to kickstart this process. They suggest asking yourself, can you think of a specific situation where you noticed yourself using this thinking style personalization?
Pinpointing it.
Yes. What were the automatic self-blaming thoughts that came up? And what specific feelings did you experience as a consequence of thinking that way? This kind of conscious, specific reflection is the very first step in beginning to dismantle that automatic habit. You have to see it clearly first.
You mentioned earlier the concept of a responsibility pie chart drawn from one of the sources. How does that tool help counter personalization specifically?
Right. While the source we looked at didn't provide like a detailed step-by-step worksheet for it, the underlying concept of the responsibility pie chart is incredibly useful. It's a great visualization and a practical counter to personalization.
How does it work conceptually?
The idea is that for a specific negative outcome or situation that you find yourself personalizing, taking all the blame for you would mentally, or you could literally draw it out, create a pie chart. This pie represents all the factors that contributed to that outcome.
Okay, the whole picture.
The whole picture. Then you assign percentages of responsibility to each contributing factor you can identify.
Ah, okay. So instead of the default personalization pie chart, which is implicitly just a solid circle labeled 100% my fault.
Exactly. Instead of that completely distorted pie that's just a solid block of me, you create a pie that includes slices for your actions, your legitimate piece of the pie. Maybe it's 10%, maybe 40%, but rarely 100%.
Right.
And then slices for other people's actions or inactions, their pieces. And slices for external uncontrollable circumstances, Slices for the weather, the economy, unexpected system failures, budget cuts, random chance, timing, etc.
So, for example, if a team project failed.
Your pie chart might have a slice for your specific tasks. Maybe a slice for a colleague's delays on their part, perhaps a slice for unclear communication from management, maybe a slice for unexpected market changes that affected the project, and perhaps a slice for a key resource suddenly becoming unavailable.
This exercise forces you to, like, externalize the situation and actually distribute the responsibility among all the contributing factors. It makes it immediately obvious that you are rarely, if ever, 100% responsible for a complex, negative outcome that involves other people or external events.
Precisely. It's a direct, visual, logical challenge to the automatic, emotionally driven 100% self-blame of personalization. It helps you see the situation more realistically, more accurately, preventing the entire weight of the negative outcome from crushing you.
That seems really practical. Okay, and finally, tying in self-compassion again, how do we actively bring that into the process of challenging personalization and building this healthy responsibility?
Self-compassion is absolutely critical because it fundamentally changes the internal climate in which you're doing all this challenging work. It's the emotional backdrop.
Okay.
If personalization and self-criticism involve viciously beating yourself up for mistakes, setbacks, or perceived failures, self-compassion is the polar opposite. It's meeting those exact same moments with kindness, with understanding, and with a recognition that imperfection, difficulty, and making mistakes are just part of the shared human experience. Nobody gets it right all the time.
Right.
The source on self-criticism explicitly links self-compassion to having less fear of failure. When you practice self-compassion, you're more likely to view mistakes not as proof of your inadequacy, but as opportunities for learning and growth.
So it actually makes you more resilient.
Yes,
Yeah.
it makes you more resilient and more likely to try again after failing, rather than being paralyzed by the fear of that harsh and internal self-judgment. It frees you up to take healthy risks.
So when personalization triggers the thought, it's all my fault and I'm terrible, and self-criticism jumps right on board to agree. Self-compassion helps you pause and respond differently inside.
Yes, it allows for a different internal conversation. Instead of these harsh attack, self-compassion allows you to say something like, okay, this feels really painful right now. I'm noticing thoughts that this is all my fault. That's that personalization pattern I recognize.
Naming it.
Naming it. Then let's look at what happened here as realistically as possible. What was my small piece? Maybe. And what were all the other factors involved? It's okay to feel disappointed or sad or frustrated about this outcome. Acknowledging the feeling. And then, how can I be kind to myself in this moment? Acknowledge the difficulty, learn what I can from my part, and figure out how to move forward without taking on all this undue blame and shame. It allows for accountability for your controllable part, but without the crushing weight of the rest.
It sounds like practicing self-compassion alongside applying that control versus influence filter, and maybe using tools like the responsibility pie, allows you to look at difficult situations honestly, own your controllable part, learn from it, but also crucially release the burden of everything else that wasn't yours to carry.
That's exactly right. It's about playing your own hand skillfully and kindly, accepting that sometimes the cards you're dealt or the way other players act won't go your way, but you keep playing your game with integrity and self-support rather than quitting the game or collapsing under the weight of every loss because you internalize it as proof of a fundamental flaw in yourself.
Okay. So understanding personalization, recognizing its roots, and actively implementing these counter strategies, focusing on control, distributing responsibility accurately, practicing self-compassion. This has a profound impact that goes beyond just feeling a bit better in the moment.
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
As we've seen from the sources, consistent personalization isn't just unpleasant, it's a major contributor to ongoing emotional distress and is clearly linked to more significant psychological challenges.
Right.
So actively working to dismantle this pattern, shifting towards a realistic understanding of responsibility, focusing your precious energy on what you actually control, using tools to contextualize blame, and integrating self-compassion into your internal dialogue, this can dramatically reduce that distress. It builds genuine emotional resilience, and it frees up immense mental energy that was previously consumed by self-blame and worry.
Energy you can use for other things.
Exactly. It is a conscious effort, though. It requires retraining deeply ingrained, often automatic habits. And it can be particularly challenging, but also particularly powerful if those patterns were established very early in life, as many of them are.
It's really a process of reprogramming your default internal response, isn't it? Shifting it from that instant, it's all my fault, to a more empowered, more accurate, and ultimately kinder, okay, what was my controllable contribution here and what did I learn?
That's it exactly. And doing it from a place of kindness and curiosity rather than self-punishment.
Wow. We've taken a really deep dive today into personalization, this common cognitive distortion where we automatically blame ourselves for things that are often way outside our actual control. We explored some of its potential, often quite painful origins and childhood experiences that can condition us towards self-blame and feeling overly responsible.
Those early roots are so important to understand.
Yeah. We looked at how it manifests, in the small everyday moments like burnt toast, but also in larger life events, really impacting our feelings and our relationships.
Scales up and down.
And crucially, we've discussed some really practical strategies to identify this pattern when it shows up, shift our thinking using that powerful distinction between control and influence.
The poker player mindset.
Right. Visually distribute responsibility more accurately with concepts like the responsibility pie, and build resilience by actively extending compassion to ourselves, especially when things go wrong or we make mistakes.
It's fundamentally a journey, isn't it? From automatically internalizing blame, making everything about me and my perceived shortcomings, to more realistically externalizing factors. Accurately discerning your true scope of responsibility and distributing blame where it actually belongs, which often includes other people's choices, circumstances, or just plain chance.
Right.
It's about redirecting your energy, shifting it away from agonizing over uncontrollable outcomes and focusing it squarely on the controllable power you have in your own actions, your own responses, your own mindset.
Trading the burden.
Exactly. Trading that heavy, often unnecessary burden of undue responsibility and self-blame for the empowering clarity and, frankly, the lighter load of focusing on your own path and behaving with integrity and self-kindness within whatever situation you find yourself in.
So for you listening, maybe hearing about personalization or recognizing some of its potential roots, maybe that resonated quite deeply. The sources we explore today offer a really powerful message, I think. While these patterns are common and they can be deeply ingrained from way back, they are not fixed aspects of who you are. They're habits of thinking.
They are habits. And awareness is always that essential first step, followed by conscious, consistent practice of these alternative strategies. It takes effort, but change is possible.
Definitely.
And maybe consider this as you reflect on our conversation today. If you were to truly commit, even just as an experiment, to stopping that automatic self-blame for everything outside your direct control, what kind of energy or mental space or maybe just feeling of freedom might that unlock for you?
That's a big question.
It is. And maybe also, how might approaching the next difficult situation or perceived failure by first asking, okay, what did my controllable actions contribute here? Rather than jumping to the immediate painful, how is this all my fault? How might that different starting point fundamentally change your emotional response and your capacity to actually learn from it and move forward constructively?
Those are incredibly powerful questions to sit with and perhaps experiment with applying even in small ways this week. This has been a truly fascinating and I think really valuable exploration. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's
Yeah.
crucial stuff.